Hey everyone, welcome back to Falcons Central Radio Show on the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I'm Aaron Freeman, founder of FalcFans.com. I'm joined by my co-host Scott Karasik. He writes for the Falcoholic. We are back this week at a new time, same day, new time though, a little earlier. This is like OG Falcons Central Radio where we used to do these shows a little earlier in the day. But we're going to be back again as usual talking about the Atlanta Falcons. The latest news is not so good that we have to catch up on. That is Jalen Collins is suspended for the first 4 games. We'll talk about that, how that impacts the season and how that impacts the Falcons draft plans. We will go a little bit into a more deeper dive on some of these first-round targets. We've talked about a lot of these guys over the past several weeks and months, but we'll target specifically some of what we see some of these guys' strengths and weaknesses and how they fit in Atlanta. And, of course, we'll always answer you guys' mailbags at the end of the show and throughout the show. So let's jump right in, Scott. Let's talk about Jalen Collins. He's been suspended for the first 4 games of the 2016 season due to performance-enhancing drugs, league policy, blah, 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 whatever. How do you think this affects, before we talk about Jalen Collins specifically, how do you think this affects the team? And obviously, he was going to be penciled in, or if not pinned in, as the nickel cornerback heading into the season. Depth is not really a strong point at the cornerback position, so losing him for 4 games is going to certainly impact their depth. Do you feel like they're going to go out there and sign a veteran? Do you feel like they're going to go out there and draft somebody, or do you feel like there's somebody already on the roster that can step up and fill that void?
Well, I definitely don't feel like there's anybody on the roster that can actually step up and fill that void. Just because Akeem King, I don't think Ricardo Allen's a nickel. I don't think Terezi's a nickel. There's not really anybody who jumps out at you and you're like, yeah, that guy would be a great nickel. So you got to look into free agency, see what's out there. Leon Hall, Crum Marty are out there. They might be a little more expensive. Gerard Powers might be solid. Peanut, even though Peanut was awful last year. Could always bring back Phillip Adams.
Yeah, I think that's probably the move that they'll wind up doing. It's just the easiest, simplest.
It makes the most sense.
Yeah, I know we signed DeMarcus Van Dyke, but he hasn't really played a defensive snap since 2011. And it's interesting because the Raiders, when they cut him after training camp in 2012, one of the players they cut him for was Phillip Adams. So it's one of those things where it's like, well, if Phillip Adams was better than him, 3 years ago, then he's probably still better than him today, since Van Dyke really hasn't done anything in the last 3 years other than play, 10 games on special teams. So, it's one of those things where I look at the guys available, and these are usually the situations where the coaching staff, when they're in a pinch, they go with someone they know. And Brandon Browner, Walter Thurman, and Mike Jenkins are the 3 guys that are available other than Phillip Adams that have experience with this coaching staff. Mike Jenkins because of Jerome Henderson when he was in Dallas, and obviously Browner and Thurman in Seattle. Thurman would be a great pickup, I think, but he's contemplating retirement, and maybe they can get him to change his mind and give it one last go, just to have him for 4 games or whatever. Browner is Brandon Browner. That'd be very less than ideal, to say the least. Mike Jenkins was pretty bad for Tampa Bay last year early on, and he got benched. And, the reason why he's not on an NFL team is largely because of how poorly he was last year. I've always had a soft spot for Peanut. For 4 games, I'd give Peanut a try as a nickel guy, but I'm not going to sit here and tell you that he's going to play well for those 4 games based off of what he did last year. So, I'm with you on that.
Kind of makes it tough to pick out what the Falcons should do when the cornerbacks out there kind of suck, and they probably should have signed Boykin.
Yeah. I mean, that's, that problem wouldn't have been as big a deal if Boykin was on the team already. Unfortunately, he's playing in Carolina, so we'll just have to, have Julio put up an extra 150 yards on him this year. So let's go veer from the team and talk about Collins specifically. How big a setback do you think this is for him this season and in the future?
I don't think the Falcons need to be relying on him for the future. It's too volatile of a situation if he keeps getting – he's been suspended for PEDs. He's been soft, if you will, on the field, not even trying to find contact. I'm just I wasn't super high on Collins when they drafted him. Like, I thought he was a first-round talent, but I didn't think he was a first-round talent for Atlanta. And then they drafted him, and I was like, that makes sense. And the pick just keeps making less and less sense. They really didn't need to take a cornerback in the second round. They should have just taken Eric Kendricks or Ali Marpet. Either one would have been fine. Because I think if they take Marpet, they don't trade for Levitri. Guard's a lot better off. And then this offseason, they're looking at guard like, well, there's some good guards out there, but right guard can be Chris Chester, Mike Person. And Marpet can play left, and center can be Mac. So I don't think it made sense to take Collins. And the more I look at the pick, the more I think about that pick, the less sense it makes.
I hear what you're saying, and I don't necessarily disagree. I do feel like there's a lot of hindsight in that. I think if we're looking at our middle linebacker position with Danny Trevathan, I don't think anybody's pining for Eric Kendricks. I think if John Asamoah was healthy and starting at right guard, I don't think anybody would be pining for Ali Marpet or anything like that. I think some of this situation is just at the time, I'm a big believer in sort of judging decisions based off of the information you knew at the time. And at the time, we thought we were pretty good at guard. And, even I thought Paul Warlow would be more effective than he was last year as a middle linebacker. And even if he wasn't, it didn't feel like it was going to be a situation where at this point in time in April of 2016 that we'd be talking about Warlow starting for us again. I certainly didn't think that, by the end of last season. So, I get why they took Jalen Collins. I do feel like this team is in a position where I don't think Robert Alford's going to be back next year. I hope for Robert Alford's sake he gets that $60 million payday that I think he deserves, certainly more so than Janoris Jenkins. And I don't think that's going to be from the Falcons. So I feel like Collins was destined always to sort of get 2 years of development and then slide into that starting spot opposite Trufant next season. I'm not as optimistic about that. Obviously I couldn't be as optimistic about where his development is going to be at that point. He does have 12 games where he can sort of show some level of confidence that, this coaching staff can have in him. But it's one of those things where I'm not ready to go and say, well, we shouldn't have made the pick. Like, I liked Kendricks last year, but Kendricks was more of a high floor, low ceiling type of guy. He was never going to be a Pro Bowl type of player. He barely won the starting job in training camp for the Vikings, beating out Audie Cole. So let's not act like Eric Kendricks is, the second coming of Luke Kuechly or anything like that.
I don't think he's the second coming of Luke Kuechly at all. But I do think that he's a legitimate starting inside linebacker in the NFL. He's at worst average.
Okay, yeah, I get you. Like, I don't want to. I just disparage Eric Kendrick to a certain extent, but I'm not trying to say he's a bad player. But I hope people aren't trying to. I think Collins is a low floor, high ceiling type of guy. I think he has a lot of potential. When we drafted him, I thought he could have been a top 15 corner in this league, in this scheme. So I kind of disagree with you in terms of him not being a great fit in Atlanta. it's going to take some time to get there. I'm not as optimistic about that. I'd be a fool if I was. Right now I'm just kind of hoping that he's just an above average starter. If he can be basically, if he can be Dante Robinson, then at this point that would be something. But I'm not going to go, we shouldn't have drafted him. Like, picks don't work out. It happens. If Collins doesn't work out, then it doesn't work out. And you hope that the next pick that the Falcons have at corner or free agent signing at corner, if they have to replace Alfred next year, is better. And that's just the situation it is. That that separates the good teams from the bad teams. It's not necessarily every pick or every signing that you make working out for you. It's just about when a player doesn't work out for you, you're able to fix the problem immediately, as opposed to historically what the Falcons have done, which is it takes another 3 or 4 years for them to figure it out. So I'm not giving up on Jalen Collins, but obviously I can understand why other people are a little bit quicker to push that button. I'm curious to see what he does in the preseason. I'm curious to see what he does over the last 12 weeks of 2016 before I'm ready to jump off the ship. So hopefully this whole situation inspires him to work a little bit harder this offseason to get ready for that point. And if it does, then I think, at least we'll say it wasn't a terrible pick. I don't know if we'll sit here and say it was the greatest pick ever, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it's just that's not the
Okay. All right, Scott. Let's jump into something a little bit more fun. Let's talk about some of these first-round targets. Let's go a little bit more in-depth in sort of the offhand commentary that we've had the last couple of weeks and months with some of these guys. Now, from my looking at it, there's basically 5 guys that have been frequently mocked to the Falcons over the last, 3 or 4 weeks at pick 17. Maybe I could throw in a 6th guy into that list, looking at some new mocks that's come out recently. But those 5 main guys would be Darren Lee, the linebacker from Ohio State, Reggie Ragland, the linebacker from Alabama, Shaq Lawson, the edge player from Clemson, Leonard Floyd, the edge/linebacker/whatever from Georgia, Sheldon Rankins, the D tackle from Louisville. And if there's a 6th guy into the mix, I would say Kevin Dodd seems to be picking up steam, and he's the fellow defensive end from Clemson across from Shaq Lawson. And maybe there'll be some other guys that we'll talk about a little bit more as well. But looking at those 5, maybe 6 guys, Scott, is there anyone that stands out to you above the rest as this is clearly the guy? If there's going to be a number 1 guy, if the Falcons draft board is 5 players deep, who's going to be the number 1 guy on that list?
I think it's Shaq Lawson. I think if he's there, he's the pick. Pretty much guaranteed. He's the ideal fit for the scheme. He can play multiple roles. He can do the strong side role. He can do the weak side role. He can be a Leo. He can be a stand-up linebacker. He can play quite a few different spots, and that versatility is going to be important to Dan Quinn, especially when it comes to how he wants to run his scheme moving forward. So I think if there's a guy who's a true number 1 guy on that board, it's Lawson.
Okay. Yeah, I personally think Lawson and Sheldon Rankins stand out from the rest of the group, the rest of the pack. I think there's a significant drop-off between those 2 guys and the rest of them. I personally think Rankins is better than Shaq Lawson. I personally put more of a stock in interior pass rush than what I think Lawson's going to provide on the outside. I think Lawson's going to be a good player. I think he's going to be a solid pro. I don't see his ceiling being a guy that's, at least in Atlanta, on another team, another scheme, it might be different. But in Atlanta, I don't see him as a 10-sack guy. I see him more as like a 6 or 8-sack guy in Atlanta.
The problem with Rankins, though, is the Falcons have shown literally 0 interest outside of talking to him at the combine. They normally bring in their guys, at least their first-round picks, on personal visits.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess, but they didn't. I wouldn't put 100% stock in that because, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I don't have an answer for that, but I think Rankins is the guy. If he's there, he's number one on my draft board. Lawson would be two, and then if we're taking Lee or Ragland or Floyd at number 17, I would not be thrilled about that pick. That's what I will say.
I don't mind Lee at 17. I do like Floyd. I think out of all of them, Floyd's the second guy on the Falcons board. Maybe not my personal board because I'd have Lee after Lawson. I like Rankins. I really do. But I don't know if taking him at 17 is a great value for what the team actually needs. I think having that redundancy to what I think having that little bit of redundancy to what Vic Beasley is on the defense would be helpful. A lot of people are saying, oh, hey, no, why take Floyd? He's basically Beasley, but taller and longer and still underweight and all this. But a lot of the great defenses out there, a lot of the great defenses ever had two guys who were very similar. So,
You have any examples?
give me 1 second because I do have examples.
Okay. Well, I'll say as you look those up, I think with Rankins, I think the value of Rankins is he has. Okay.
85 Bears, Dan Hampton and Richard Dent. The 13 Seahawks, Bruce Irvin and Cliff Averill. The 69 Vikings, Eller and Marshall. The 08 Steelers, Woodley and Harrison. The 2000 Ravens, Burnett and McCrary. All those guys are very similar in both build, speed, everything. They were basically two guys who were pretty much not the same guy, but very similar guys coming off opposite ends. And you can even look last year, the 2015 Broncos, Von Miller and DeMarcus Ware.
Well, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but I think it's a little different because in pretty much all those cases, none of those guys were examples of a team double dipping in the first round. Like Averill, Irvin was a first round pick, and Averill was a guy that Seattle signed on the cheap. Harrison was an undrafted free agent practice squad guy, and Lamar Woodley was a second or third round pick. Miller was obviously a first round pick, and Ware was a free agent signing. So it just, to me, I hear what you're saying, but I do think it's a little different when you're taking the same player in back-to-back drafts. And I think personally, I think Floyd is a poor man's Vic Beasley, and like I think Beasley has his limitations. Like it would be one thing if Beasley was killing it and was playing like a Von Miller, and then you took a poor man's version of that. But at this point, like I don't want to sound like I'm jumping off the Vic Beasley bandwagon, but I'm not ready to sit here and declare that Vic Beasley is going to be like some Pro Bowl talent for the Falcons moving forward. I think he can be, but I think that remains to be seen. And getting a guy that's less than that, and I don't think it's going to be anywhere. I don't think Floyd is going to be better as an NFL player than what Beasley is right now. And I don't know. That just seems like a bad pick to me personally, because I just don't think Floyd's pass rush ability is going to be that effective in the NFL. I think he's going to be like a D4 type of player in terms of that. Like as a situational guy, he'll get some pressures, he'll get a couple of sacks. But you look at the last 3 years of the NFL and look at all the pass rushers that got 6 or more sacks, and there's really only 1 or 2 guys that you could say have that sort of tall, long, skinny build that Floyd has. That would be Willie Young and Daniil Hunter. And Willie Young, if that's the comparison, that's not a good comparison, because Willie Young, for his first 4 years in the NFL, had combined 6 sacks. Now he's had like 16 in the last 2 years, but if you're using a number 1 pick, you're not going to wait 4 years before a guy starts to be a productive pass rusher. That's just a wasted pick right there. So I don't think that type of a body that Floyd has translates to being a prolific pass rusher in the NFL as much as people say. And then when people say, oh, well, Floyd's best trait is his pass rush ability, that scares the crap out of me because like he's not going to be a good pass rusher. And if that's the best thing he can do, then you're staring at a pretty average NFL player in the face, I think.
I guess I'm just higher on him than you are because I like what he brings to the table. I like his athleticism. I like his overall ability. I like the versatility that he brings. I do think that you might be disappointed come draft day when Shaq Lawson's not there and the Falcons have to take someone and it ain't Lee, it'll be Floyd. And I guarantee you it's not Rankins just because they haven't looked at Rankins. As much as everybody loves Sheldon Rankins on draft Twitter, I don't think the league is as high on him as we are.
We'll see. I mean, traditionally, the league hates short defensive tackles. So, you would hope that if anybody's going to go in the top 15, like I think Rankins can go in the top 10. I have a mock coming out later this week that has him going in the top 10, but we'll have to see what happens.
Well, and here's the other thing. So say the Falcons all right, 1 second. Max. All right, so say the Falcons take like Floyd in the first round and Rankins does fall to the second round. Because NFL teams traditionally don't like those shorter, stockier defensive tackles. Who's to say that the Falcons don't get both?
I don't think NFL teams dislike Sheldon Rankins that much that he'll fall in the second round. I think if he's on the board at 70, I just don't see why the Falcons wouldn't take him. Like just because they haven't worked him out like that to me would be ludicrous. It's hard for me to see him falling past, I don't know, like Cincinnati or somebody like that, or some team like that, picking in the early 20s or the late teens. So that scenario of getting him and somebody else, I just don't see it. I don't see any of these guys that we like. The only person I could see out of the 5 guys we named fall into round 2 is Ragland.
Yeah.
Just because there aren't that many teams that need inside linebackers in the first round. It's not a premium sort of position, especially when you're an inside linebacker that doesn't cover that well. Like the ideal scheme for Ragland is the 3-4. And you look at some of the 3-4 teams picking in the first round, a lot of them don't really need inside linebackers. Like Chicago.
The only one that really makes sense is Buffalo.
Yeah, and Preston Brown and Reggie Ragland, like I'm not saying Preston Brown's as good as Reggie Ragland, but they're kind of the same sort of player. Kansas City could use another inside linebacker, but I think they tend to like guys that are a little bit more athletic than Ragland is. And so I could see them going with a wide receiver or cornerback or somebody else that brings a little bit more upside for them. So I think Ragland could fall.
I wouldn't be shocked to see Kansas City take Jalen Smith in the first round, honestly. They're the kind of team that likes to take a guy a year out. And if they have to sit him and let him get healthy and then put him in, they will gladly do that, especially for a guy like Jalen Smith.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I don't think
I could see him doing that.
I don't see Jalen Smith.
Derek Johnson right before retirement.
Okay. I don't see Jalen Smith sniffing the first or second round at all this year. Maybe the third round, but I don't think anybody's going to take a chance on him.
You have to remember, NFL teams do dumb shit all the time.
Yeah, I agree with you, but there's a precedent with the exception of Willis McGahee. Teams tend not to take these sort of redshirt guys in the third or fourth round. I saw Brandon Thomas a couple of years ago, Marcus Lattimore. I guess Dom Easley would be an exception, but he did play his rookie year, unlike what I think is going to happen with Jalen Smith, but we'll see what happens with Jalen Smith. I think if unless his medical recheck, and we'll talk, there's a mailbag question later, so I'll save some of this for that. But unless his medical recheck is like the most amazing thing that doctors have seen, the most miraculous recovery, I just don't see any NFL teams taking him in the first 2 rounds at all.
I think that's fair, but again, it all does depend on his medical recheck. But if his recheck goes well, I think Smith goes right to the Chiefs.
Okay. We kind of gloss over these guys. Darren Lee is a guy that is an interesting fit for the Falcons. I don't love him as a linebacker. I really think people are overrating him as a linebacker, especially in this Falcon scheme. I think people look at him and say, oh, he's fast and he can cover. That's all that really matters, and not really paying attention to how that works. I mean, the weak side linebacker in this scheme plays a lot more zone coverage and man coverage. And so when you get a guy like Darren Lee, who's actually not that good in zone coverage, he's much better in man coverage, and you're just kind of wasting his ability if you're going to play him at weak side. I like Darren. Like, if we take Darren Lee at 17 and put him as sort of a hybrid safety / linebacker and ask him to play man up some of these tight ends that we're going to see this year, I like that pick much more than I like him if we plug him in at weak side linebacker and ask him to, basically be Sean Weatherspoon, basically be like, when I look at Darren Lee in comparison to some of these other first and second round linebackers that have gone over like the last decade, the closest player comparison that I could see is Alec Ogletree. And with Ogletree, he's been a very average NFL player. Like, the Rams just basically told us what they think about Ogletree when they just paid Mark Barron, a converted safety, $40 million this offseason. And now they're moving Ogletree to middle linebacker. They basically Mike Personed Alec Ogletree. And by that, I mean they went out and got a better player for $40 million and then said, oh, play this other spot that you've never really played before because you could be better than the terrible player that we had at that spot last year.
Ogletree played Mike in college.
Did he? I thought he played Sam in college.
No. He played Mike in a 3-4 for Georgia for 2 years.
Okay. Well,
he was a projection to Will because he would play on the weak side more often than the strong. But he was, either a Mike or a Ted. But he was more of a Mike in the 3-4.
Okay. Either way. He's going to be a traditional 4-3 Mike this year in the Rams defensive scheme. He's going to be making the play calls and whatnot, which I don't think he did at Georgia. Someone could correct me if I'm wrong. To me, I don't even think Darren Lee's as good as Ogletree was. So I look at it and I think people are too enamored with athleticism and thinking that just because you're athletic, you can be a high level NFL linebacker, and I don't see it with Darren Lee. He's too soft, for lack of a better term. He's too soft.
I think he's perfect for a Will. I do agree that he could fit well as, tell him to lose weight, all this weight he's been trying to gain, and, come up to, or go down to, 225, 230, and try and use him like a faster version of Cam Chancellor. I'm not saying he could be as good as Cam Chancellor, but he's probably a better athlete than Cam Chancellor is. I think that could fit what they're trying to do. It's just, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it is the strong side. I mean, not the strong. The strong safety plays a lot more man coverage than I think people realize, and is often asked to match up one-on-one against tight ends. And that's just something that we don't really see the weak side linebacker do all that much. It happens occasionally, not to say it never happens, but it's not really what the scheme values in that position. It's more about, can you play in space, can you run, and can you hit? Now, obviously, Lee can run. I don't think he can really hit. And I think you're going to put him in a scheme and you're going to ask him to make a bunch of open field tackles, and I just don't think that's really his ideal sort of strength, at least for measuring him as a linebacker. I think you can sort of allow being a little light if you're a safety because you're more playing as the last line of defense as opposed to the first line of defense that you are, or the second line of defense if you're a linebacker. If your linebackers can play, then you don't really need great tackling safeties. So if your linebackers can't tackle, then you know. So I don't know. It just, for me, Lee's a fine player. I think he could work in a lot of different other schemes. Like if you put him in Arizona, I think he could be great. I think in Atlanta, if you play him as a linebacker here, you're going to be disappointed. I think a lot of people are underestimating how raw a player he is, given his lack of experience, given his, lighter in the pants playing style, and given his lack of ideal instincts. I don't think those things are going to change. I think he's always going to be a little undersized. I think he's always, instinctually, you can say he'll get better because he doesn't have a ton of experience playing linebacker. But like, to me, when we compare him to say someone like Sean Weatherspoon, like I think 2 years from now, Darren Lee could be the prospect that Sean Weatherspoon was coming out. But I think people think he's going to be that guy right away. Like he's already that guy, and I don't think he's that guy. I think before we can get to a level where he's comparable to what Sean Weatherspoon was early in his career when he was healthy, I think that's going to take like 4 years for him to get there. And that to me is not ideal for a top 20 pick, especially when you already have two sort of short-term stopgap options at that spot already in Spoon and Wheeler. So I don't really like his fit there at linebacker.
Fair enough. I think the Ogletree comparison is interesting because Ogletree was the guy who made the defensive calls his junior year and his sophomore year. Michael Gilliard got injured partway through the sophomore year before Marlo Herrera took over as a first-year starter and didn't really know what the hell he was doing. So Ogletree is interesting because much like Lee, he's a very football smart kind of guy. I think Lee's a football smart kind of guy. His frame isn't really used to playing linebacker, and I think if he did get up to, say, 240, and it's like weight that's stuck, and he kept his speed, I think he could be a fun middle linebacker in the scheme. I don't like his fit at will either. I would rather see them go with like Deion Jones in the third round at will, but they have to like what Jones is off the field, and that's where the question comes in. Jones is a way better zone defender than Lee is, for sure.
Okay. All right. I'm not a huge fan of Deion Jones either, but I think if we're looking for a weak side, I'd rather have Deion Jones at 81 or whatever than Darren Lee at 17. So I can go with you there. But if Deion Jones is our pick, if we draft Deion Jones at any point, I sort of expect him just to be an average sort of NFL starter. I don't expect him to be good. I think a lot of people being higher on him is because Quan Alexander is like the first LSU linebacker in like 8 years to be good in the NFL. And people think, oh, well, he's just like Quan Alexander. It's like, no, not really. He's just a guy. But hey, and people are always probably listening like, man, Aaron, you hate all the linebackers in this draft. And I'm like, I don't hate them. It's just a bunch of average NFL starters, I think. Like, I think we're going to look back at this draft class 5 years from now, much the same way we look back at the 09 defensive tackle class where it was like B.J. Raji. And like you look back at that draft class and it's like Terrence Knighton and maybe like one other guy, or like the only guy still left in the league, and that was the Parade Jerry, Ziggy Hood, Jerron Gilbert. That was a fun guy.
Tyson Jackson.
Yeah, even though he was a DN in college.
DN in a 3-4, defensive tackle in a 4-3, same damn thing.
No, he played DN when they were a 4-3 team.
But yeah, Ziggy Hood, Ron Brace.
Yeah, you look back at that draft class and it wasn't a good D tackle class, and it was one of the reasons why the Falcons, I think, reached on Parade Jerry, because he got moved up the board largely because it was an average group, and teams still need defensive tackles even though if it's an average draft class. And And I kind of see this year's linebacker class. There'll be guys that'll start. There'll be a couple of guys that emerge as decent to good NFL players. But I think by and large, if you need linebackers this year and you're trying to draft a starter, you're probably going to end up disappointed, much like a lot of those teams that drafted D tackles, 7 years ago, were disappointed. So, great offseason to need a linebacker, right, Falcons? So I'm glad that worked out. So we talked about some of these top 5 guys. We gave our thoughts on them. Are there anybody else of these other guys that are sort of these outlier candidates for pick 17 that you want to comment on? I mentioned Kevin Dodd earlier. I've seen some mock. The Falcons had worked out Jason Spriggs last week. They worked out Jack Conklin yesterday. I've seen a lot of mock drafts still sort of pegging the Falcons for A'Shawn Robinson. We've talked a little bit about Keanu Neal. Maybe the Falcons like him enough that they might take him in the first round. There's 2 other edge rushers that no one's really talking about as much anymore, but could still be targets, like Emmanuel Ogbah or Noah Spence. Any of these guys jump out to you as a good fit for the Falcons, or the opposite end is a bad fit?
Out of all of them, Noah Spence. Spence would be a very good fit. He could line up at linebacker. He could line up at Leo. He understands how to play multiple spots. He can press rush from both sides. His issue is he's not athletically great, but he does have good. The one thing is if you don't have great athleticism as a whole, if you have good what was it called? Density. If you have good density, if you've got enough weight for your height, it'll make sense. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, we were during the Senior Bowl, run up to the Senior Bowl. A lot of people were talking about, or after the Senior Bowl, a lot of people were talking about Noah Spence being a top 10 talent. I never really saw him in that light. I've always saw him as a good player, as a late first round sort of guy, as a guy that if he had tested better, I wouldn't have minded the Falcons taking him at 17. But I think that's kind of like, it's not kind of, it is a reach. He's always sort of seemed to me, even before he blew up the Senior Bowl or whatever, it always seemed to be more like a DeMarcus Lawrence type of player who was drafted early in the second round 2 years ago. And I know athletically their comparisons are pretty similar. And so that's kind of the type of player that I see Noah Spence being. And if we traded back in the first round and took him at 26 or something like that, I wouldn't have any problem with that at that point, because I think, talent-wise, typically in the draft, usually picks 26 or so through 42 or about the same. Historically speaking, it's like a really late first round pick versus an early second round pick is about, you're getting the same sort of value. It's usually the top 25 picks that are the quote unquote true first rounders. So I could see Spence working out. I'm not a huge fan of Ogbah. I know he's very athletic. He's got the length that we traditionally associate. His motor, he doesn't play hard. That's what I will say. He seems like he's loafing it to me a lot of times when I watch him. And I just don't see that fire that I want, the guy that's going to go out there and hunt the quarterback like you want. Now, maybe he can come to Atlanta and be a good player and be a better player, and he'll get coached up. But I don't know. He's a talented guy, but he just seems to be – he's a boom-bust sort of player. And with Dodd is a player I like. I don't see him being this dominant pass rusher. But I do feel like he could be a competent complementary pass rusher. And the player I compared him to a couple of days ago was Ray Edwards. And I know the minute I say those two words together, people immediately roll their eyes and just throw up a little in their mouth. But I'm referring more to the Ray Edwards that was in Minnesota that was actually a pretty good player and understandably made the Falcons want to sign him. And then, Ray Edwards stopped caring about football after that point. But like I think Dodd could be that type of player that if you put him across from a Jared Allen type of player, that you could see him be a productive 6 or 8 sack guy on an annual basis. The problem with Dodd is he's probably like Ray Edwards, better as a left end than a right end. And if Beasley's already got the left end locked down, then you got to move one of those guys, and probably you might move Beasley. But yeah, I think Dodd could be. I wouldn't pick him at 17. I think he's a reach at that point. But if he wound up being the Falcons' pick, I wouldn't be that upset about it.
I'm with you. I wouldn't be upset about it. I don't want him that high. I don't like the fit that high. It just feels way, way, way too early for Dodd. Like, I've got a mid-first round or mid-second round pick on grade on Dodd, and if they took him at like 50, I'd love it. I would love the pick. Take him at 50, put him at strong side end, have Beasley play strong side linebacker, and the nickel have Beasley drop down and play end, have Dodd move inside. Because we've seen Dodd throw people around. I just don't. It's not worth it. It really isn't. He's not worth that high of a pick. And I like Josh Dodd. I just don't like him at 17. Just like I like Keanu Neal. I just don't like him at 17 because he's got holes in his game that don't really make him worth that pick.
I hear. All right, Scott, you want to jump into these mailbag questions?
Yeah, definitely.
All right. We got one from last week that we missed from Digital Demon. He says, and we got 2 questions about Jalen Smith. So his one is, how far does Jalen Smith fall if you're the Falcons and you take him in that round? And Andrew Shawwaller asks, if Jalen Smith's medicals come out positive in the recheck, do the Falcons look at him in the second round?
If Jalen Smith's medicals come back and say that he can basically play half a season this year, yeah, he's worth the second round pick. I may be a little crazy in saying that, but I think the potential there is a top 5 linebacker. And I think if you take a guy in the first round who, maybe it's Leonard Floyd, maybe it's Shaq Lawson, maybe it's Darren Lee, even no matter who you take, Jalen Smith as a second round pick, as a linebacker, his film is at least pretty damn good for what you want as a middle linebacker in this scheme. That's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing a middle linebacker in this scheme. He's not Bobby Wagner, but I mean, he's a damn good linebacker. And he's got the athleticism to be good in coverage.
Okay. I'm one of those people. I don't love Jalen Smith as much as the rest of the world. I don't love his fit as a middle linebacker, but I do feel like a healthy Jalen Smith is talented enough that I would be willing to roll the dice at him as a middle linebacker. I see him more as a 3-4 inside linebacker, weak side sort of guy, in terms of getting the maximum ability out of him, because I don't think he's as physical as I'd like a middle linebacker to be at the point of attack. The thing about Jalen Smith, though, is, and I know he denied it at the combine, but I don't really buy what he was saying. And, I don't know. I don't have any inside information. I can only base it off of what I've read. But if he does have legit nerve damage, and it sounds like everybody outside of Jalen Smith's circle seems to be saying that, yeah, he does have nerve damage. And if they're not outright saying it, they're just kind of hinting at it, then I just don't see the reason to pick him. This is not like a normal knee injury where, it just heals. He sits out a year and then he comes back as the player he was. Like, someone asked a question on Twitter today about what's the difference between Jalen Smith's nerve issue and Peyton Manning's nerve issue. And, as someone who's not a doctor and who's only can speculate because I'm not their doctor, but I don't think there is a difference. But we saw with Peyton Manning, his nerve issue, and he had like 4 surgeries on his neck to sort of try to fix it. We saw him come back in 2012 and really lose a lot on his arm strength. we saw it firsthand as Falcon fans in that first game on Monday night where he threw 3 picks, primarily because he couldn't put enough on the football. And we saw over time that diminished to this past year where he was arguably the worst starting quarterback in the NFL for about 12 weeks this season. So it's one of those things where if Jalen Smith has the equivalent of that in his knee, and you say, okay, instead of arm strength, it's going to be his speed that he loses, then if you remove Jalen Smith's speed and he just becomes average in terms of his speed or below average in terms of his speed, then there's really nothing that he's really bringing to the table over any third or fourth round linebacker that you could draft that won't have these issues, because the real value of Jalen Smith, at least in my opinion, is his speed, is his potential as a coverage guy, is his ability to run that 4-4 and match up against slot receivers and top-level tight ends. But if he all of a sudden becomes average in the speed department, instinctually and physically, he's good. And I'm not trying to sit here and say he sucks or anything, but there's nothing special about him. And, then at that point, then you're like, well, the only other thing that he brings to the table is maybe pass rush. But again, if the knee's an issue, then I'm not going to really expect him to be a great pass rusher. So I, personally, as someone who has no access to this information, I don't really think there's anything that's going to happen in a medical recheck that's going to change the outlook on Jalen Smith. I think if he has nerve damage in his knee, unless a doctor looks at those x-rays or those CT scans or whatever it is, the MRIs, and say, oh, the nerve has actually regenerated in the last 2 months, and it's going to keep doing that, which would be a medical miracle, because nerves don't really regenerate.
Or it could be the doctor misread all the stuff and said, and like, oh, it really isn't nerve damage. That's more likely.
There's 32 teams that saw his medicals, and it's not like, oh, well, all the people that have been reporting on it talked to one guy. Yeah.
It could also be that some teams are trying to push his value down.
Well, I think that works. I think that happens a lot, but I think teams are pretty skittish on medical stuff. We saw this with Vilma, when he had the degenerative knee issue, and the Jets were basically trying to give him away, and the Saints were the only team that really showed any interest in it. Like, teams are real skittish on medicals issues with guys, and I think there's going to be enough teams that are going to sit there and say, we don't know, and because we don't know, we'd rather go with a guy that's a known commodity, even if he's going to be a much lesser player than Jalen Smith. Now, I could see a playoff team like a Minnesota, like a Kansas City, or a team like that saying, you know what, third round, if he's still there, we'll take a flyer on him. If it doesn't work out, it's not a big deal because we already have a playoff-ready team as is, and we're not going to, lose a whole lot by wasting, quote-unquote, wasting a third or fourth round pick. But if you're a team like Atlanta, or you're a team like Chicago, or any team that's trying to get to the playoffs, you're better off taking a guy that can contribute right away, as opposed to a guy that might be able to contribute a year from now. So that's what I see. We look at the redshirt guys, the Brandon Thomases, the Marcus Lattimores, a lot of these guys that teams took a flyer on knowing that they were going to sit out their rookie year, or most of their rookie year. Very few of these guys have worked out for those teams. I think Willis McGahee is really the last example of that working out, and that was like 2003. So San Francisco's done it a bunch with Tank Carradine, and it hasn't worked out any time with them. So I think other teams are going to look at that and say, yeah, it's not worth it. We'll just take Deion Jones. We'll take Josh Perry. We'll take whoever, and we'll be okay. All right. Next question. Smorgasbord 9 asks, Darren Lee and Shaq Lawson are available at 17. Who do you draft?
Darren Lee and Shaq Lawson? That's really a question?
Yeah.
Shaq Lawson. Come on, man.
Okay.
You not watch the show?
Apparently not. All right. Digital Demon asks, if Keanu Neal is off the board, would you take Darian Thompson or Sua Cravens to play safety, strong safety?
If who is off the board?
Keanu Neal.
Keanu Neal. I would gladly take Darian Thompson. In a heartbeat.
I don't like Darian Thompson as a strong safety, to be honest with you.
Really?
I think he can do it, but I wouldn't draft him in round 2 to play strong safety. Like, if I'm drafting Darian Thompson, I want him to be a free safety. Like, I don't know, I don't think he projects that well to strong safety. I know he has like size, and people will talk about him hitting guys, but I think he's really more of a center fielder than a box strong safety. He can do it in a pinch, but I wouldn't draft him projecting him in that role. With Cravens, I think I've always thought Cravens was a better fit as a strong safety than a linebacker, just because similar to Darren Lee, I think he's too soft to play linebacker in the NFL, or at least play linebacker and be good in the NFL as an every down player. So I wouldn't be against drafting him in round 2 to play strong safety. I wouldn't love the pick. I don't see him growing into being a great player. I just see him being like an above average starter. I'm trying to think, who would I like? I'd probably just wait till round 3 and take Jeremy Cash. If Keanu Neal's off the board at pick 50, I'd probably wait and just take Jeremy Cash. Smorgasbord 9 has another question about safeties. Your thoughts on Justin Simmons and his fit with the Falcons? Could he and Allen be on the field together?
I mean, I think they could. I think it would mean that the Falcons would have to adjust their scheme from what the Seahawks scheme was. I do like the fit of Simmons as more of a center fielder, but Allen's a little too small for strong safety. So I think you'd probably see Allen move back to that like nickel corner, just because it makes a little more sense. If you ask me, I think that's just what makes sense. I think Allen could play that nickel corner. I think he'd be a good fit at the nickel corner, but at the same time, he did a good job at free safety last year. And Simmons may not have the power that most strong safeties have for the scheme, but he's way better in coverage than pretty much anyone but Cam Chancellor, as far as like strong safeties that have been in a scheme similar to this.
Yeah, I think the scenario where Simmons and Allen are on the field together, because I do feel that both of them are free safeties and you would be miscasting both of them as strong safeties, is if the Falcons, instead of playing nickel, they play dime and they put 6 DBs on the field, and you put Simmons and Allen in the back as the regular safeties. You play 3 corners, and then you bring your 6 DB is like a Kamal Ishmael type that basically is just a linebacker at that point. So, yeah, that would be the scenario where I could see them on the field together. It makes sense to do that if you have a big sort of box strong safety like a Kamal Ishmael that is basically a linebacker, to maximize the speed on your sub package as opposed to going to nickel. And especially when you have our linebacker situation where you don't really like, if you could take Paul Warlow off the field in nickel situations and then put either Wheeler or Spoon there as that one linebacker in a dime, that makes sense. We used Wheeler there last year. I think you can use Spoon there this year because I think Spoon is an underrated blitzer, certainly a better cover guy than Wheeler is, and probably just as good when he's healthy against the run. So that would be sort of the ideal situation in that scenario. Yeah. Okay. Evan Birchfield's got 2 kind of questions. He says, idea for the next show. with the recent article about the top 5 Falcons. Scott and Aaron give your top 5 and why. And he also says, suggests what about we give our worst top 5 Falcons ever.
Top 5 Falcons ever. Jesse Tuggle, Tommy Nobis. I'm going to be a little bit of a homer. I'll throw Matt Ryan up there. Probably best quarterback the Falcons have ever had. Mm-hmm. Even though, he may draw some flack, he's better than Barkowski. I think he's way better than Chandler, Jeff George, or Jim Miller. And after that, it's just a bunch of crap. Lester Archambault for both name and pass rush purposes.
Okay.
He was a solid 8-sack guy. And these are just guys that I was old enough to see because I don't remember Claude Humphrey playing. I never saw Tommy Nobis play. Not unless I went back and watched old film and old videos and stuff that my dad had around the house. I never really saw much of Nobis. So, and Dion in that top 5.
Yeah. If I'm picking my top 5 favorite Falcons, I would pick Dion, Tuggle, Babs, Julio, and Obi Mahaley. If I'm picking the 5 guys who I thought had the best careers as Falcons from an objective point, because again, like Scott, I'm not old enough to see all these guys play. It would be Humphrey, Ken, Nobis, Matt Ryan, and Tuggle. I can't believe I forgot Tuggle. If I'm picking the top 5 worst Falcons, I guess that would be players who I did not like. And I guess I wouldn't pick somebody who just played 1 year with the Falcons. So I can't pick Mohamed Sanu. Let me see. I'd have to think about this. It's too hard. There's been a lot of bad Falcons, so a lot more bad Falcons than good ones. So it'd be hard to whittle it down to 5. So maybe next week, Evan, I can give you an answer.
Worst ever? Yeah, I mean, when Tony Graziani is a name that you're man, that guy probably could make that list, but may not make that list.
Tony Graziani.
Tony, I feel that's a fair name to throw in consideration for the worst 5 ever.
That's a good one. I like that. It's not that deep of a dive, but I like it. He's up there, yeah.
Kurt Kittner.
Yeah, anybody that played for the 03 quarterback for the 03 Falcons could be on that list. Doug Johnson,
Kurt. 07 Falcons.
Yeah. All right. We got 2 from Joseph, Broseph929. He asked, the first one is, what are some backup quarterbacks in the draft do you want?
Not a single one of them. I don't think that the Falcons need a backup quarterback. They spent money on Matt Schaub. You don't draft a backup quarterback when you have 5 picks. Maybe if they trade down from 17 to 43 or 42 and pick up a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, pick up 5 or 6 picks, and they've got a total of 10 at the end of that, then yeah, sure, take a backup quarterback. When you got 5 picks, don't do it. Not worth it.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. It's one of those things where I don't think they're going to draft a backup quarterback unless they trade back and get 5 extra picks. If I'm answering the question, no, I haven't really studied any of the quarterbacks just because I just never saw it as a realistic option for the Falcons to draft. But I'm a big believer in the idea of you're going to have Matt Ryan as your starter, then your backup should be some athletic, strong arm, basically Dominique Davis, but not as bad as Dominique Davis was, a better version of Dominique, a Tyrod Taylor type of player. And so if the Falcons were to draft a backup quarterback in some unrealistic scenario, then someone like a Trevon Boykin or a Dak Prescott or
you said strong arm. Dak does not have a strong arm.
It's okay. Okay. Jacoby Brissett, somebody like that would be the sort of guy that I'd be like, yeah, that could be worth a shot to see what they can do. Would they develop any better than Dominique Davis did? I don't know, but I'd rather take time developing one of those guys than sort of your Sean Rimfrey type of quarterback who's just going to be a game manager, best case scenario, in an average one at that. So I don't see that. I don't understand why teams sort of draft those guys, but it is what it is. Broseph 929. Second question is, what is one sleeper in the draft?
There's way more than one sleeper. But if I had to pick one out of all of them, it's Jake Brendel, that center out of California, Los Angeles. If he wasn't a center, he'd probably be much higher on a lot of people's boards. He's extremely athletic. He doesn't have any really bad habits. He's a little raw, but at the same time, he's just very fun to watch do his job. I like Brendel. He's if you're building the prototype center or the prototype guard for a zone blocking scheme, I think Brendel's right up there. He just doesn't have a lot of he didn't have a lot of ass in his pants. Like, he doesn't have a lot of strength off the line right away. So it's going to take him a little bit to get to where he needs to be strength-wise. And I think a lot of that's going to come with being in a pro-strength program. But if you want guys that can move, you want guys that can do the job, Jake Brendel's the guy.
Okay. This guy is a guy I was, when I got a 7-round mock draft that's coming out later this week, and I was looking at some guys that could be possible targets for the Falcons and round. Those are guys like looking down a list and just looking at any inside linebacker that has a good 3-cone. And I stumbled upon this guy and I had never heard of him. And then I went back and watched a couple of highlights, and then I watched the game of it, and I was like, I kind of like this guy. James Burgess from Louisville. He's a guy that he's like 225 pounds or something. He's pretty undersized, but unlike a Darren Lee, I think he plays bigger than what his size merits. So he's one of those guys that, unlike Darren Lee, like if he puts on 15 pounds, like I feel like it'll actually benefit his game as opposed to just being 15 pounds of useless muscle, as is the case with Darren Lee, because it's not going to make him a more physical player. Burgess is a decent cover guy. He's not going to be a guy that's going to line up one-on-one against a Greg Olsen or Rob Gronkowski and handle. He's going to get beat. But he's a above-average cover guy for a college guy. You go back and you watch that Clemson game that Louisville played. He had a nice interception on a wheel route when he was covering Jordan Leggett one-on-one. He's probably going to be a special teams guy. He's more of a backup sort of guy. But if the Falcons took him late in the draft, like in round 7, plugged him in at middle linebacker and said, you know what, you got more coverage potential and you got a much more physical disposition to your game than Paul Warlow. Within a year or two, we're going to try to play you a middle linebacker. I think that would be fun. Whether he ends up becoming a good starter remains to be seen, but he's a fun prospect, so he's a sleeper of mine. Okay, Evan Birchfield asks, what positions do you think the first 3 picks will be?
I think it's going to be a pass rushing end. I think it's going to be a strong safety of some sort, and I think it's going to be a linebacker.
I think it's going to be linebacker, strong safety, and tight end.
Tight end, really?
Yeah.
I guess I'm just not in love with this tight end class, and outside of Hunter Henry, the Falcons haven't really shown any interest in any of them. So I'm not really super focused on it. I think they could take Nick Vannett in like the 4th round and be fine if they were taking a tight end.
If I'm not mistaken, I think they worked out all 5 of the top 5 tight ends. They worked out Hooper at Stanford. They worked out Bennett at Ohio State. I think they worked out Jarrell Adams at South Carolina. They went to South Carolina, and we don't know specifically which guys they worked out, but it's pretty safe bet that they worked out Jarrell Adams. They worked out Hunter Henry, I think. So I feel like the only top guy that they haven't worked out is Tyler Higbee, and I don't think they're going to be too worried about that moving forward. Just because I don't think he's going to get drafted because of his assault issues over the weekend. So I do think they're going to take a tight end pretty high. It might be 4th round, but I do feel like because it's not a great class, they're going to take him in the 3rd, get their guy in the 3rd round, and see what offensive lineman is there in the 4th round.
I still think they go defense pretty heavy in the first 3.
Okay. That's a possibility. This is one of those drafts where I don't really know what the Falcons are going to do. So we'll see. Okay. ATL Justin Tyler asked, review McShay's 3-round mock, and what is your realistic 3-round mock for the Falcons? I guess I have to look this up.
I didn't know McShay did a 3-round mock, but I also –
let me see. I just had a link up. I looked at it earlier. What was it? I know Darren Lee was his 1st-round pick. And he has Cody – no, I'm sorry, wrong team. Hunter Henry is the 2nd round, and Carl Nassib in the 3rd round.
So he has the Falcons taking Darren Lee, Carl Nassib, and Hunter Henry?
Yeah.
All right, so I like the focus on the line and the focus at speed at linebacker. I'm really high on Nassib. I do think Nassib's a better pass rusher than he gets credit for. I just think he's awful against the run. Like, damn near atrocious against the run. So I think if you get Nassib, you're looking at a guy who he may take a little bit to develop just because you got to teach him how to play against the run. But once you do, you might have a strong side defensive end who's worth a shit. And I like his frame. I like his size. I like his athleticism, especially for his height, being able to do a 3-cone in 7.27, that burst off the line, the 1.62. I mean, that's he's got the athleticism. I question whether he's got the explosion, but he's a guy that I would gladly take in the 3rd round based on his numbers. I mean, I prefer Bronson Kafusi to him, but I mean, when you're comparing Kafusi to Nassib, the difference isn't that much.
Okay. I didn't watch a ton of Nassib. I've seen a little bit of him. I wasn't overly impressed by him, and then when I found out that the Falcons were the only team that didn't go to Penn State's pro day, I kind of was like, oh, well, I can just kind of cross off all the Penn State players off of my watch list. I know there's like 2 pro days that the Falcons did not attend, and that's like Rutgers and Penn State. So that pretty much nixed sort of in my mind the idea of us taking them. I don't know, just like based off what I've seen of Nassib, he's a fine football player. And, it never hurts to add another pass rusher to your mix. But to me, he's more closer to Derek Shelby type of player, like as more of a rotational end than a true blue starter. And when you already have Claiborne and Beasley and Shelby and now Upshaw in the mix, I just don't see the value in drafting another guy like that with a premium pick, like a 3rd-round pick. The other picks he has, Henry is a player I like. I haven't watched a lot of Henry, largely because I just never thought he would be available when we get to round 2. At pick 50, I just always assumed some team was going to take him at like 40 or 45 or something like that, like Chicago. So I like him. I think he's a good player. I get why some people see him as the number 1 tight end. I don't see as big a gap between Henry and like the 4th guy in this tight end class as much as other people do. I think Austin Hooper's just as good. I think you can make an argument that Austin Hooper's a better fit because I think Hooper's more of a red zone threat than I think Henry's going to be. And some of these other guys, these other tight ends, like I don't think there's a huge gap between Henry and like the fourth best guy.
I would much rather them wait till next year to take a tight end. Jake Butt, OJ Howard, Jordan Leggett. Those three guys, take one next year in the first round.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to take any of those guys in the first round. But if one of those guys is there in the second round, I might take them. But I don't think drafting a tight end this year really precludes you from drafting one next year, just because you kind of need two tight ends in this league, and Tammy's going to be gone next year. So you draft Henry this year, you draft, of those guys you named, I like Jake Butt the most just because his name is Jake Butt, and he's a good player. I
like him because his name's Butt.
It's a great name. And obviously, you guys know how I feel about Darren Lee in round one. So, McShay's draft, I've seen worse drafts than this. I like the Henry pick the most out of all three of these picks, but the other two picks are fine. Just they're not going to get me super excited. Like, oh man, the Falcons really killed it in this draft. Like I'm looking at his picks for the Colts, and he has them taking Joseph, Cody Whitehair in the first two rounds. I'd much rather the Falcons draft those two guys with their first two picks than Darren Lee and Hunter Henry, personally, but that's me. Okay, where are we? Okay. Evan Birchfield asks, predicting the schedule, what do you think the first game will be for us?
Saints at home.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a division game, so Carolina, Tampa Bay, or New Orleans, more likely.
I think Carolina going to Denver, that's going to be the opener because that's Super Bowl rematch. I think that's going to be the Thursday game. And then the rivalry with Tampa Bay is just not huge. So if you had to pick a game, I think the Saints either the Saints in Atlanta or the Saints in New Orleans is going to be that game.
Okay. Well, I think the whole Mike Smith connection and the fact that the Bucs swept us last year would make that a little bit more compelling. And yeah, so. Okay. Evan Birchfield asks, can you explain how you come to your conclusions on the draft prospects, drills you look at, etc.?
I watch a lot of film. A lot. A lot of guys you can see within 3 or 4 plays, whether they're like even worth the league. As horrible as that sounds, some guys you can just see they're too slow, they're not strong enough, their technique's just atrocious. So you're like, I don't want this person in the league.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree to that to a certain extent. You can you should be able to get a good gauge of what a guy is in his first 10 or 15 snaps. Now, obviously, you can find out that your initial impression of the player is wrong as you watch more tape, and that does happen. But generally speaking, once you've gotten to a certain level of evaluation, you should be able to tell what a guy is within, a quarter or two of watching him.
Like Shaquille Rashad out of North Carolina. Good athlete, but no instincts.
Okay.
Like zero instincts whatsoever. If he had instincts with his frame, he'd be a second round pick. And with his athleticism, he'd easily be a second round pick.
I guess the easiest way to answer this question, Evan, is a lot of it is kind of trial and error. There's a lot of guys that, I started doing this in 2001. That was the first draft that I actually started watching players. I was an 18-year-old in high school. And basically what I did then was I watched all the bowl games. And then based off of how a guy played in that one game, I wrote a scouting report on him. And I wouldn't recommend doing that. I know a lot better now. And that sort of gives you a skewed perception of players. Like if a guy has a really good bowl game, then you're like, oh, he's a second round or a third round talent. And you come to find out he's not. A lot of it is athleticism. One of the things that you learn over time is more often than not, athleticism does matter. That's why when people say the combine doesn't matter, they don't know what they're talking about, because most of the guys that are good in the NFL are good athletes, like 90% of them. It's a lot of it is some guys that you really liked this one year and then they turn not to be good, and you're like, oh, well, this one aspect of their game I overlooked, and I was just putting too much emphasis on their athleticism. I think that's a lot of the Darren Lee hype. Is a lot of people are hyping up his athleticism and not really looking at the other factors. Because I was high on Ogletree when he came out. I was super high on Ogletree. I thought, oh, this is the new quote unquote breed of linebacker in the NFL. And you look at Ogletree, and he's been pretty mediocre in St. Louis. Not terrible, but just kind of average, to the point that a safety is outplayed him. So it's just kind of like
Mark Barron should have always been a linebacker.
Okay, I don't quite agree with that, but it's I can't really deny it because that's the way it's worked out. So yeah, it's just a lot of like you're wrong about players, and then you sort of apply the new information that you get from that to the next group of players, and then some players you're right about and you apply it, and it's a lot of trial and error. So that's one of the reasons why I'm not as high on Leonard Floyd as I was on guys like Kiki Mingo and Deion Jordan, because I was really high on those guys, and then they've basically been mediocre at best NFL players. I'm not as high on Leonard Floyd. Now, I could be wrong about Leonard Floyd. I don't think I am, because you don't see many players like Leonard Floyd being successful in the NFL, because this is not the first time a player like him has come into the league. Manny Lawson is another good example. But it's the same thing with, it's the same thing with Darren Lee, I think. So it is a lot of watching film, and there's a lot of looking at sort of athletic testing. It is a lot of just comparing these guys to previous examples and seeing if those guys had a high degree of success in the NFL. Because the thing that people got to remember is most guys don't end up being good in the NFL. Most guys end up just being average. Your typical NFL player is going to be a Stephen Nicholas, Thomas Deku type of player. You're as a starter, and that's just if you are lucky enough to start. Most starters are on that level, not on the Von Miller, Jonathan Babineau level. And then the vast majority of guys that come in the NFL are backups. So it's one of those things, like if you want to be safe about a player, just predict him to be a low-level starter or a backup. And probably 60% of the time you'll be right. So that's one of the reasons why I come to the conclusions. That's why I'm not as optimistic on guys like God.
Well, for me, it's more about potential and what can they be. So there are guys who grade based on floors, which is what Aaron does. He says, what's the worst that this guy's going to be? What's his likely case scenario? I mean, that's what it is. And every NFL team has those guys. They've got that guy. His job is to go find what the worst this guy is going to be for that team. Boom, that's his floor. And then what's the best this guy's going to be? Where can we take his talents? How can we use him at his absolute best and get the most out of him? And for me, that's what I see with players. I see guys at their absolute best. I see Shaq Lawson as a guy who can be a 10, 12-sack guy year in, year out, be that primary pass rusher, and be that sneaky kind of guy the way Charles Johnson was. And I realize Charles Johnson may not come off as like the ideal player for some guys, but when you go back and you look at what Charles Johnson has done in his NFL career, and you average it out, outside of this year, which was a down year for him, I mean, you're looking at a guy who's played, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years in the NFL, has 63 sacks. If you take out his rookie year and this past year, when he was either learning the game or injured, you've got 63 sacks over a 7-year span. So, sorry, 63 over 9. So 63 sacks over a 7-year span. That's a 9-sack guy who, coming out, wasn't as good as Shaq Lawson is now. I think Shaq Lawson is like second-year pro Charles Johnson. He's starting off at a higher spot. He has more versatility. He's shown it. He has more potential. He's shown it. That's not to say Charles Johnson's a horrible football player. Charles Johnson's a very good football player. But at the same time, you've got to have the right coaching, the right spot, the right scheme, and the right talent around you to really make impacts.
I'm with you on that. I don't necessarily say it's me looking at a guy's floor. The way I usually judge it is what is a guy's ceiling, what is a guy's floor, and then what he's going to be is somewhere in between. Like I think very few players hit their ceiling. Like we can sort of sit here and rattle off all the guys that hit their ceiling, and it's a much smaller group than probably people think. So I don't actively.
Most of the 2011 NFL draft.
It's one of those things where I don't actively go out and say, oh, this guy, like, unless I feel really good about a player. Like, I feel really good about Miles Jack. Like, I really, feel like he's going to hit his ceiling. I feel like DeForest Buckner is really going to hit his ceiling. I feel like Joey Bosa can hit his ceiling.
See, Bosa gives me pause.
Well, I don't think Bosa's ceiling is as high as people thought it was. I don't think it's J.J. Watt. I think his ceiling is like Justin Smith.
I was going to say Patrick Kearney in his prime years where he was getting 12 to 13 sacks.
Yeah, I'm thinking Cincinnati Justin Smith. Now it's 49 Justin Smith. The guy who was consistently getting 8 to 10 sacks a year.
I think that's fair. I mean, I think Buckner could be – I'm not saying he's Calais Campbell because I don't think he's Calais Campbell, but I think he could be a damn good football player. Probably a better version of Chris Canny is his ceiling, at least to me.
See, I think he is Calais Campbell.
I don't know. I think Calais Campbell's a more athletic player than Buckner is. I like Buckner. I just don't think he's the same kind of athlete Calais Campbell is.
Okay. All right. All right. Let's move on to the next question. Andrew Scheiwaller asks, "Is there any way you would trade up for Miles Jack?"
No. I like Miles Jack. Okay, if he falls to 14 and it's going to cost a future fourth, then I trade up for him in a heartbeat. But if it's going to cost a pick this year, it's not worth it. You don't have enough picks, and trading up to 8 is probably going to cost a future second or a second this year, and it's just not worth it.
I'd have to think. It depends on what you would like. The Jets gave up a first, a second, and 3 mid-level players to move up from 17 to 5 in 2009 against Sanchez. Now, I don't think you can give up. They were able to pull off that trade because Mangini was the coach of the Browns who they traded with, and he was formerly the coach of the Jets. So those guys they traded to Cleveland were guys that he had coached and he had liked in New York. I don't think you can do that today, obviously, because, the same circumstances don't exist. But if you could trade this year's first, this year's second, and next year's second to get up to the top 5, I think really hard about doing that. Just because middle linebacker is such a huge need. I am one of those people that thinks Miles Jack is the best player in this draft. I agree. Jack, you put him on this team and you are instantly a top 10 defense at the very minimum. I think, to me, it's the same sort of idea behind the Julio. We only have 5 picks, right? But you go back and you look at that 2011 draft, and we only wound up with 6 picks after the Julio trade. And really only 2 of them outside of Julio really worked out, and that was Quiz Rogers and Matt Bosher. And I feel like if you keep 4 picks, you can kind of get the same sort of value in this year's draft as Quiz Rod. You can find a Quiz Rogers equivalent at any other position, or a Matt Bosher equivalent at any other position with those 4 picks or the 3 or 4 picks you keep. And as long as you still have your first round pick next year, to me, you come out light years better than you did in the Julio trade, where we gave up a second and a fourth in 2012. So, like, if we could do that, I would think really hard about trading up for Miles Jack. I know I'm not a big believer in trading up. I think it's generally a bad strategy. But if you can do it without giving up a future first round pick, I think for Miles Jack, it might be worth it.
So you're saying trade up for Jack, then in the third round get, say, just throwing an example out here, get, say, Bronson Kafusi. Then in the fourth round get, say, I don't know, Thomas Duarte, because they did go to UCLA, work him out. A great athlete, could play tight end. Very similar to Jordan Reed.
Yeah.
Then in the seventh round, get, I don't know, Jake Brendel. Have at least a rotational H-back style guy. Have a depth center guard who can play all 3 of the interior spots in case someone gets hurt. Have a rotational defensive end who's a better version of Tyson Jackson because he can actually play the run and pass rush. I'd be okay with something like that, but that means that they'd have to get like those specific guys. And then you'd still be down picks, and you still have to sign some free agents. You still wouldn't have a true strong safety. I mean, there's still a lot of issues in that situation.
Yeah, to me, I think it's hypocritical for people to be like, oh yeah, the Julio trade was a great trade, and then be against trading up for Miles Jack. I think it's the same sort of decisions. So if you don't like a trade up for Miles Jack, then you probably secretly don't love the Julio trade as much as you claim to.
The Julio trade kind of sucked.
I mean, like, I think the Julio trade, I think the benefit of the Julio trade is it made us instantly a better football team. And that was evidenced by how far we went in 2012. I think the downside of the Julio trade is we lost basically 4 players on the roster that we didn't do a good job of filling those spots with the picks we kept and with free agency and with the undrafted guys. I think if you're making a logical decision about this Jack trade, then you're basically saying, okay, we're getting the value in the immediate value in the player like we got with Julio, but this time around we'll do a better job of filling those holes that we're not going to be able to get, that we're giving up in trades with the picks that we keep with free agency, with undrafted free agency. Now, is that a good bet? I don't know. You know, it depends on how much confidence you have in this coaching staff to evaluate and develop players, how much confidence you have in Thomas Dimitrov selecting the players. So if you don't have any confidence in those guys, then obviously then you don't like this trade. But if you have confidence, and if, you know, again, the question is, would I do it? If I was running the team, I would do it because I would have the utmost confidence that I can find talent, certainly better than Akeem Dents of the world, or the Lamar Holmeses of the world. So
the thing that was kind of aggravating there wasn't that they traded up for Julio. You're right. It's that they took Akeem Dent over, say, Jordan Cameron, who I was banging the table for, or even KJ Wright, who I wasn't super high on but has been pretty solid. But over Jordan Cameron, they could have taken Jordan Cameron, had a future tight end. I hated that they gave up their 4th round pick. I don't think that they really needed to give up their 4th round picks. And they could have kept their 4th round pick and taken Cortez Allen from the Citadel in the 4th round that year. Had a guy who could have manned up on tight ends, which was an issue in the 2012 season, because that's the only thing he really does well. In the 5th round, that was the year that Richard Sherman went in the 5th round. Atlanta traded up for Jacquizz Rodgers.
yeah,
Which was stupid. They could have stayed in their spot, taken like Pernell McPhee, and been fine.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not.
I'll never be mad at Matt Bosher. That was a great pick. It's a 6th-round pick. It's a punter. If you take a kicker or a punter higher than the 6th round, you're just stupid. And then Cliff Matthews in the 7th. I mean, that was a solid pick for depth. I mean, there's guys after him like Malcolm Smith, but like, who knew how good Malcolm Smith was going to be? Really, who knew how good Malcolm Smith was going to be? So you can't get too mad at that one. And then later on, guys like Patrick DeMarco were undrafted free agents. Chris Harris, the cornerback for the Broncos, undrafted free agent. I mean, as far as the UDFAs, there aren't a lot of guys that went undrafted who are you're like, oh my God, these guys are just absolutely amazing.
Yeah. Okay. Falcons ATP asks, what do you think of Blake Martinez?
He's okay. I mean, I don't love him in coverage, but he's a solid football player. I think he'd be a good pick in like the 7th round for what the Falcons need.
Okay. I haven't watched enough of Blake Martinez to really have an opinion on him.
But that 3-cone.
There you go. The magic of the 3-cone.
No, he's a solid football player. I just don't love him in coverage in the scheme.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen a little of him. He's fine. You know, he's okay. He's going to be one of those guys that's going to play in the league for 7 or 8 years, might be a functional to decent starter for a couple of years based off what I've seen. But, again, I haven't seen a whole lot of him to have a strong opinion on him. So that's what he seems to me. Okay, Dylan Jennings asks, major if, but if Atlanta traded up to 2, who would they pick? Who would they pick?
Miles Jack.
Yeah. I said in September or October, Miles Jack is the #1 player on the Falcons board. So he's the guy. If they're trading up for Miles Jack.
Don't get me wrong. I love, the idea of DeForest Buckner in the scheme. I love the idea of, Joey Bosa in the scheme. I love the idea of Laramie Tunsil, getting drafted to play right tackle and having Schrader kind of slide inside. But at the same time, it's kind of an overvalue of resources to do that. I mean, and after those guys, I got Shaq Lawson and Leonard Floyd near the top of my board. Like, I mean, maybe Jalen Ramsey as a unique fit for the team, but as like a free safety-ish, strong safety-ish, nickel corner-ish kind of guy. Just like a guy you move around and use everywhere you can. But even then, I don't think taking a safety like that is worth the #2 overall pick. So ideally, the Falcons don't. Ideally, the Falcons don't trade up to the 2nd round to the #2 pick. It's just not worth it.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't have anything to add to that. All right, folks, that's our show for tonight. I hope you enjoyed the earlier time. Now you don't have to stay up till 1 o'clock like you did last week to check us out. And you can watch us at any point in time on YouTube. You can head on over to profootballcentral.com. Video and audio will be up there either tonight or tomorrow. Please subscribe to us on iTunes at Falcon Central Radio. If you want to send in a mailbag question, you got to get them in earlier now that we're at a new time. We're planning on doing 7 o'clock on Tuesday every week moving forward. So if you want to get a mailbag question in, use the hashtag Falcons Mailbag. You can tweet at the show at Falcons PFC. You can tweet at me. I'm at FalcFans. Scott is at Karasik S. To get in touch with us, if you want to shoot any ideas our way on what we should do next week, because I think next week is our last show before the draft, if I'm not mistaken. So if you have anything that you want us to get out of the way, before, the week after is obviously going to be a draft recap. So send those questions in, use that hashtag, and we'll get to them. And Oh, yeah, I should plug when I have a 7-round mock draft coming out, probably Thursday or Friday. It's not just the Falcons pick, it's all 253 picks. Put a lot of work into it. So please give me the clicks and the likes or whatever for that. I'm going to be posting some team needs in the next week or so. And yeah, be on the lookout for that. And then it's just, waiting for the draft to hit. So that's what I have on deck. Scott, you got anything on deck in the coming days or weeks?
Yeah, I've actually moved over to Sportsnut, just because of outside reasons. And yeah, I've been writing a little bit about the WWE. I'll be writing about the NFL draft as a whole. I'll have probably an all-team first round mock-up pretty soon. I had a top 25 board I posted up. I'm going to have a couple articles about things we hate about the NFL or the all-athlete team that I'm working on for this year's draft. That'll definitely be up. So keep your eyes peeled. I'll definitely have some new ideas thrown out there.
There you go. All right, folks, that's our show. Check us out next week, 7 o'clock Eastern.